What's up, audit fans? Dr. Amanda here, and I thought I'd start ASA 315 on camera because it's one of the most important standards I feel in the whole suite of auditing standards that we have. And it's really important because 315 is about understanding the client. It's about building this picture of what the company does, who they are, how they do it, and all of those factors flow into how we're going to plan the audit. So if you don't quite get this right, or this component of it right, then it can have flow-on effects. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't come back from having a poor understanding of the client, but I think that what's really important is that it can take you longer on the audit if you discover certain piece of information later or have to adjust or adapt later on down the track. Now, that's not to say that that doesn't happen. You always find out more information, and there's always lots of instances where you need to adjust and change plans on your audit. That adaptability is critical. But in ASA 315 or ISA 315 about understanding the client, there is so much to cover. So much to cover that in fact it was actually the focus of my PhD thesis about how we actually, as auditors, figure out whether we have an understanding of the client or not. So I'm going to dig into the standards, and this is going to be, I think, a three-part series. First part is this bit where I'm going to talk about what the standards actually require us to do. The second part, I'm going to talk actually about the explanatory material, and I don't often get into explanatory material, but I think in this instance it's really important to do that because it contains a lot of detail on what auditors should be doing and the sorts of information to help them develop this understanding, which is a really vague term. And then part 3 of the video series on 315 is actually going to be about talking about the new exposure draft. So if you didn't know, there is a new exposure draft currently under discussion at the international and at the national level. I'm going to talk in my third video about the exposure draft and where things are going. So let's get into it. Digging into our standards, 315 is about identifying and assessing the risks of material misstatement, and we do that by understanding the entity or our client and their environment. So in the contents, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here. I'm going to look at, in this video, the requirements. So what is it that we're legally required to do? In part 2 of the video, I'm going to go into the explanatory material. And then in part 3 of this series, I'm going to look at the new exposure draft. We have our usual conformity, so ISA and ASA 315 are all the same. We have some particular standards that are marked, or paragraphs that are marked with the AUS, which applies just to those people who are here in Australia. So let's dig into the scope, and the scope is always important because that's the purpose of the standard. It's the auditor's responsibility to identify the risks of material misstatement. That's really important to know because what we're doing is we are conducting risk-based audits. Now, that means that we don't audit every single part of the financial statements exactly the same. We don't take the same approach. We don't spend the same amount of time. We spend more time where there's more risk of material misstatement. So how do I know where different parts have more risk? Well, we do that by understanding the entity and their environment, including their internal controls. So for me to be able to identify these risks, I need to do it by knowing the company. If we scroll down a little bit here to the objective says we want to identify the risks of material misstatement, whether due to fraud or error. So we have to keep an eye out for fraud risk factors or possible mistakes. Now, we do this at a couple of different levels. The financial report level, so the overall level of the client, and then the assertion level. Now, what do we need to know? Well, we need to understand the entity and their environment. So what's the client? What sort of industry and regulatory environment do they work in? The company's internal controls, so that then we can design and implement responses to the risks. And those designing and implementing responses, what that actually is that is going to be our audit strategy.
how are we going to go away and collect evidence to support our opinion? And we do that by considering, what does the company do? What are their risks? Because we are taking this risk-based approach to audit. There's definitions. So I'm not going to dig into the definitions, but there are things like assertions. We need to understand what assertions are, and they're contained within the appendices of ASA 315. We need to understand business risks. We need to understand the policies and procedures or internal controls, the risk assessment procedures that the auditors are going to do, and then identify something called significant risks. These are really critical because these are going to be areas of importance. Oops, I can't spell there. And these areas of importance are ones where I'm going to spend more time. I'm going to spend more of my audit effort because I think there's a greater chance of material misstatement there. So what are my requirements? And remember, the requirements are the things that auditors are supposed to do to comply with the auditing standards. So my requirements say I should perform risk assessment procedures, all right? But they're not in themselves sufficient and appropriate evidence. What I should do in my risk assessment is talk to management, do analytical procedures, and observe and inspect to help me identify significant risks that are likely to affect the financial statements. Paragraph 10 is an interesting one because it says that the engagement partner and team members shall discuss the possibility of misstatements with the team. So this is a very collaborative approach to audit. We need to make sure that everybody is involved. I might be auditing sales and someone else could be auditing accounts receivable, and there could be linkages between those two. Now remember before, the ASA says that the auditor must have something called an understanding. All right, they have to have an understanding. Well, what exactly is included in the understanding? These paragraphs here actually tell us what they need to have for this understanding. Now, remember, the auditor has to use their professional judgment to determine whether they have a sufficient understanding of the client. That means that there is no specific number of pieces of evidence or specific pieces of information that are going to constitute this sufficient understanding. So the auditor has to use their judgment to decide how much is enough. What sort of things do they recommend? The auditor shall obtain an understanding of the following. The first one is industry, regulatory and other factors, and the applicable financial reporting framework. Now in our instance, that's going to be the AASBs or IFRS, if you're an international viewer. We also need to know about the nature of the entity. That is, what does the entity do? How do they operate? Who owns them? And what's their corporate governance structure like? Who's on the board? Who's on the audit committee? How do we vote people onto the board? Where do they spend their money? What type of investments do they put their funds into? And how is the entity structured and financed? Is it a company like Peak Design, for example, that is mostly funded by Kickstarter? Is it a company that relies on a lot of debt? Or is it a company that relies on equity financing? So I need to know what's the business so that I can understand the transactions, account balances, and disclosures to be expected. And that line about to be expected is really important. What the auditor should be doing is anticipating what they should see. So what should they be seeing for clients in a particular type of business or a particular industry, or particular company structure? So I need to know about the industry. I need to know about the industry. I need to know about the company. And then I also need to know about their accounting policies. Now that also means that there could be a link between ownership and governance structures and operations and executive compensation and perhaps accounting policy choice. I also need to look at objectives and strategies. What is the business trying to achieve? Because our accounting policy choice, our operations and our governance structures will be affected by those strategies. And lastly, the final thing, which I need to include, is how do they measure and review financial performance? Like all of these other factors, it's not as simple as individual items. These are all interlinked in complex relationships. And agency theory tells us that managers are likely to be self-interested. Is there something to help align their interests with those of shareholders? How are people going to behave? So for auditors, we not only need to know accounting, but we also need to understand human behavior and motivation. And that's really, really important. There's a great video by Dan Pink, I'll link it in the comments, about understanding human motivation. Now, I mentioned that the auditor needs to have an understanding of the client, and that understanding also needs to include an understanding of the company's internal controls. So what are the things that we need to look at? And I'm just going to adjust the screen a little bit here and put this on the side. ASA 315 does talk about components of internal control, and we have 5 components of internal control. Number 1, the control environment, the structure of the firm, culture, philosophy. Then the risk assessment process. What do they do to try and assess risks? We also look at whether they have processes to evaluate internal controls, information systems, and monitoring those systems. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw these in a slightly different diagram. And this comes from a textbook that I once saw, but it's quite a common diagram in that we need to understand these components in the following way. So the first one is understanding the control environment. I'm going to change the color on this so that it's black. It's nice and clear. So the control environment sets the foundation of the firm. What's it like to work there? What's their philosophy? The next thing we need to talk about is risk assessment. How does the company manage risk, and what do they do about it? Is it a risky industry? How often do they evaluate risk? In response to risk, we want to evaluate the control activities. What are the things that the company does to try and minimize the risks that come out here? Then we need to think about the company's information systems and communication methods. How does the company go about actually managing and collecting data on their risks? And the reason that this goes across a number of different areas is because we want to collect information on their environment, or the client should be collecting information on their environment, on their own risks and their control activities. And the very last one that we have at the top is the monitor function, which is, are we doing something to keep an eye on the controls, on the risk assessment and the control environment? And often we use information within that system, within those systems to do that. Over here where it says components of internal controls, we've got the control environment down here, risk assessment process here, information systems here. Control activities and monitoring are actually going to be on the next page of the standard. So flipping over into that next page, you can actually see that here we have the control activities and the monitoring of those controls. So we're trying to do all of this to really understand what the company does, how they do it, and then what's the outcome. The reason that we're trying to do this is this section here, where we need to identify and assess risks of material misstatement so that we can identify the specific areas on the audit that are going to require additional attention. All right. When we go over to the next page, it says that I need to identify risks that are more likely to be pervasive throughout the financial report, that where things could go wrong, there could be misstatements. So those are things, as I mentioned earlier, that require special audit consideration, where we're going to do more in regards to those audits. Now, the question that always comes up with my students is the question about how many. How many of these risks do we need to identify? When I was doing my PhD and I was working with Professor Roger Simnett from the University of New South Wales, and he was talking to International Auditing Standards Board members. The feeling was that auditors will probably identify 5 to 7 significant risks. All right, now there are definitely going to be more risks than this on the entire audit, but at this stage we're looking for the biggest 5 to 7 showstoppers that are going to really affect our audit. And when we've identified those, then we have to think about, well, what are we going to do about it? I should consider these risks, and then in ASA, I'm pretty sure it's ASA 330, we're going to look at what we do next. What are we going to do about those risks? Of course, I mentioned earlier that audits need to be flexible. We do need to consider the possibility of revising our risk assessment during the audit if we find new information. The very last section is documentation. Remember, documentation also comes up in ASA, ISA 230. And again, we have to document all of these risks and the information that we've gathered. That's it for the first video in this section. The second one, I'm going to go through the explanatory material a bit to talk about how we might understand the client a little bit better. And then in our third video, I'm actually going to talk about the new exposure draft for 315 and how that's going to change things a little bit in the future. Thanks for watching. If you found the video useful, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up, a like. Consider subscribing for more videos on auditing standards, and information relevant to accounting students. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.